Probably the most natural place to start when reflecting on this issue is the first chapter of Genesis, where we're given an account of the creation of the heavens and the earth. Most Bibles render the first verse like this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," full stop. But many modern commentators regard this as a bad translation, claiming that it should instead be rendered, "In the beginning, in which God created the heavens and the earth, ... or "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, ... So, in other words, they interpret verse 1 as an incomplete sentence. And that's because in the phrase Bereshit, the noun Reshit looks like it's in the construct rather than the absolute state. In Hebrew, a construct noun is the head noun, also known as the nomen regens, of a genitival construction. This type of construction is used when the head noun is being qualified by another word or words with which it's being attached in a construct chain. Now, stick with me here, because it may sound complicated, but it's really not. Here are two simple examples of Hebrew construct chains. Ish Yisrael, a man of Israel, and then Eshet HaMelech, the wife of the king. In the first example, the word man is the head noun of this short construct chain. In the second example, the word wife is the head noun. The head noun will always be in what's called the construct state. That just means that it's being linked to, and therefore qualified by, another word or words that follow, and are therefore syntactically linked within what's called a construct chain. In this first example, the word man is qualified by the word Israel. So we're not just dealing with man in some generic sense, or the man, as if no further qualification were needed to express who it is that's being described. Rather, we're dealing with a certain man, a man of Israel. A construct noun can usually be translated by adding the word of in order to indicate its genitival relationship with the word or words that follow. In the second example, the word wife is the head noun, so it's in the construct state, and it's qualified by the word king. So we don't just translate this as a wife the king, but the wife of the king. The definiteness of the construct noun is determined by the word or words that follow. In this case, that word is the king. Since this word is definite, we translate this phrase as the wife, not a wife, of the king. Many words, when written in the construct state, will have a slightly different orthography, in other words, a slightly different spelling, and they will also often have a different vocalization. And that's what happens here in the second example, since the word for wife is normally isha, not eshet. The final letter he has been altered orthographically to a tav. There's also a reduction in the vowel length in this word. The comets is reduced to a segol, and then this leads to a further change of the vowel under the aleph, so that instead of a chirik, we have a tsere. If you've studied any Hebrew, you will have certainly learned about this type of grammatical construction. So this shouldn't be something that only advanced students in Hebrew can understand. All right, with these grammatical points in mind, listen to this short clip from Dan McClellan.
So Bereshit does not mean in the beginning. It occurs a grand total of 6 times in the Hebrew Bible, and in not one occurrence does it mean in the beginning, or is it translated in the beginning. It is the nomen regens, or the first word in a construct phrase, in every single other occurrence. And that is very clearly what we have going on here. There are a few indications of that. To begin, if it were in the absolute state, if it were standing as a phrase on its own, it would be barishonah. It's not, it's bereshit. So that ending indicates it's in the construct, as does the absence of a definite article under the preposition. Those 2 vertically arranged dots, that's called a schwa. That indicates no definite article. If there were a definite article here, we would expect to see a single horizontal line that is indicative of a vowel known as a patach. So what we have is the first element of a construct phrase. And a construct phrase is X of Y. It indicates that genitive relationship that we indicate in English with the word of. So it adopts the definiteness of whatever follows. And in this case, the rest of Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. And that's a large phrase to be acting as the nomen rectum of a construct phrase, but we can interpret it as an unmarked relative clause, or we can just revocalize bara to be baro, as we see in Genesis 5:1, an infinitive construct. And that would mean what Genesis 1:1 is saying is in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, or in more idiomatic English, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So it is a temporal clause, and verses 2 and 3 are describing the state of affairs when God began to create the heavens and the earth.
So there you have it. Every other place where Bereshit occurs in the Bible, it's rendered, in the beginning of. If the author had wanted to say, in the beginning, without any further qualification, he would have written, Barishonah. The fact that he wrote Bereshit with a tav at the end and a schwa under the initial bet shows that he intended for us to read this as the first part of a construct chain. I'm afraid, however, that this evidence is not nearly as compelling as Dan McClellan and others would like to imagine. For one thing, 4 of the other 5 occurrences of Bereshit in the Hebrew Bible are found in just one book, the book of Jeremiah, and these are all used in the same kinds of statements. Jeremiah 26:1, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. Jeremiah 27:1, again, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. Or some manuscripts and versions read Zedekiah. Jeremiah 28:1, and it came to pass in that year, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. Jeremiah 49:34, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. And then Hosea 9:10, like a first fruit in a fig tree, in its beginning, Bereshitah, literally, in the beginning of it, I saw your fathers. Okay, so that's one reason that commentators give for interpreting the noun reshit in Genesis 1:1 as being in the construct state, because every other place that it occurs in the Hebrew Bible, it's in the construct state. So why should we read the phrase any differently in Genesis 1:1? But this is a logically fallacious line of reasoning. As I said, 4 out of these 5 other occurrences of the phrase are found in just one book, and they all occur in the same kinds of sentences, where the prophet is speaking about himself receiving oracles at the beginning of a particular king's reign. Moreover, in all of these verses, the grammatical situation is different from what we see in Genesis 1:1. In Genesis 1:1, the phrase Bereshit isn't followed by another noun or a pronominal suffix, but by a finite verb. The Masoretes vocalize this verb as bara, that is, a cow perfect, which we would translate as he created. This suggests that the word reshit was not understood, at least by the Masoretes, as being in the construct, but in the absolute state. In fact, I'll demonstrate in a subsequent video that all of the ancient translators understood this as being in the absolute state, not the construct. As far as we know, the first person to have understood it as being in the construct state was Rashi, the famous Jewish commentator from about 1100 AD. I'll talk more about Rashi and his proposed interpretation a bit later. Okay, given the fact that the grammatical situation of Genesis 1:1 is different from the other occurrences of Bereshit in the Bible, and given the fact that ancient translators consistently understood reshit in this verse as being in the absolute state, why are so many commentators so confident that it can only be interpreted as a construct noun? Well, as you heard, Dan McClellan claims that if the author of Genesis had wanted us to read the initial noun as being in the absolute state, he would have written Barishonah.
If it were in the absolute state, if it were standing as a phrase on its own, it would be Barishonah. It's not. It's bereshit. So that ending indicates it's in the construct.
This is something that Dan gets from Rashi. But Dan is confused. He apparently thinks that the absolute form of reshit is rishonah. It's not. Rishonah is a different word. The absolute form of reshit is reshit. There's no difference in spelling between these two forms. We can see that in these two texts from Deuteronomy 33:21 and Nehemiah 12:44, where the term is used in the absolute state. The term is also used in the absolute state in Isaiah 46:10, where we read, Magid mereshit acharit. This verse is talking about the beginning and the end of Cyrus's calling or reign. God declared both of these things before they happened. Now, I feel like I need to reiterate here some of what I said a moment ago, because I've heard at least two individuals on YouTube trying to dismiss the relevance of Isaiah 46:10, and I think it's because they're misunderstanding something.
The beginning here, that word, reshith, in verse 10, it's also relative in meaning. That phrase is more like a proverb. The point is, it could be translated something like declaring start from finish. There's no articles there, start, finish. It's not the start and finish of time. It's just idea. Like there's a finish line, there's a start. And the point is Yahweh declares the finish from the start. It's not about which finish, it's not about which start. It's just the point is that he can do that, right?
So when I'm looking at the interpretation, like when God began to create in the beginning, my two options are like one absolute starting point and one like relative, like not, it doesn't specifically say what the starting point is. That's how I'm looking at the context. So in Isaiah 46:10, if we're going to interpret the same way, like I guess those are our two options. When it says, I make known the end from the beginning, in this context, are you saying the beginning is like a relative, like long period of time, or is it just a certain period of time, or is it an exact period of time, or am I completely missing the point of what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. But it would be helpful just to rephrase the word beginning to like start. Because even in English, the word beginning, it has these connotations, right?
Yeah.
Actually, the way I'm trying to explain this verse in Isaiah, that's how most evangelical, like major commentators put it, which really surprised me. Presumably the same people who would be defending the traditional view in Genesis 1:1, they all have a similar translation. It's somewhere along the lines of this: declaring or announcing the outcome from the beginning or the start. And some of them don't even have the article. So it could be announcing the outcome from the start and so like you could translate it that way. And obviously when you would read that, you wouldn't think like the point is about the beginning of time. The idea is just generic. It's just general. It's not specific. That's the whole point, is that in general, God can declare things.
So yeah, I really don't think these guys understand what the issue is here. The issue is not whether reshit is being used to speak about the absolute beginning of the world. When commentators say that in this verse, reshit is used in the absolute state, they just mean that it's not in the construct state. If it were in the construct state, we would expect it to be followed by a noun, pronoun, or infinitive construct, as in this phrase, Bereshit Mamlechut Yehoiakim, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. In this phrase, the word reshit is being qualified by two words, Mamlechut and Yehoiakim. In this type of construction, reshit is said to be a nomen regens, the leading noun, and Mamlechut is a nomen rectum noun, the noun at the rear part of the construct chain. It has a genitival relationship with reshit. Yehoiakim is another nomen rectum noun that qualifies both Mamlechut and reshit. Isaiah 46:10 is different from this verse because it uses reshit without any nomen rectum nouns, pronouns, or infinitive constructs. So when you hear the word absolute, don't think of this as the opposite of relative. We often talk about things like time or morality being either absolute or relative, but that's not how the term absolute is used in Hebrew grammar. The issue is not whether the Isaiah passage is talking about a unique event in history, the absolute beginning of the world, or whether it's talking about an event that can only be understood in relation to other events in history. In this verse, Reshit isn't modified by a nomen rectum, whether a noun, pronoun, or infinitive construct. That means it's in the absolute and not the construct state. Okay? And a different, but also relevant grammatical question that needs to be asked here is whether mereshit in this verse is referring to some definite event in history from the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or some indefinite event from a beginning of Cyrus's reign. It's clearly talking about the former. So I think the grammatical issues are not really being understood here. No one is claiming that Isaiah 46:10 is talking about the beginning of the world. Well, I shouldn't say that because I can't really speak for everyone. But if anyone is claiming that, then I'd tell him the same thing. He's not understanding grammatical concepts and is therefore missing the point of why this text is relevant to our understanding of Genesis 1:1. It's relevant for two reasons. First, because it shows that when the noun reshit is used in the absolute state, it's spelled the same way as when it's in the construct state. Second, it shows that the noun doesn't have to be written with a definite article or with some other definite nomen rectum word linked to it in order for it to be considered definite. I'll have more to say about the term's definiteness in just a bit. So again, we don't have to understand Isaiah 46:10 as referring to the absolute beginning of the world. We're just looking at this term for its grammatical features, and that in itself can't tell us whether the author is talking about the absolute beginning of the world or the beginning of some event that can only be understood in relation to other events in history. Additional data would need to be considered in order for us to discern anything about that particular issue. In Isaiah 46:10, Reshit refers to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or perhaps the beginning of his calling. It's in the absolute state, just like in Deuteronomy 33:21 and Nehemiah 12:44, because it's not being modified by another word, and it's definite even though it doesn't have the article. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Now, the other piece of evidence that Dan McClellan mentions as support for the construct reading of Reshit is its vocalization.
So that ending indicates it's in the construct, as does the absence of a definite article under the preposition. Those two vertically arranged dots, that's called a schwa. That indicates no definite article. If there were a definite article here, we would expect to see a single horizontal line that is indicative of a vowel known as a patach. So what we have is the first element of a construct phrase.
Yeah, so this isn't correct either. True, the missing definite article on Reshit could be interpreted to mean that the Masoretes read this as a construct noun, but there are other possibilities too. For one thing, the term could just as well be interpreted as indefinite, in which case it would still be absolute, but we would translate it like this: in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I only mention this as one possible way to construe the grammar because I want you to see that Dan has overstated his argument. Construed like this, Reshit could still be interpreted as being in the absolute state. It may be indefinite, but it's still in the absolute state. All right? I'm not convinced, though, that this is actually how the author wanted us to read the text. The non-specificity would have only provoked the reader to ask, which beginning? Were there other ones before this one? The line of questioning that would then have followed would have only distracted from what the author was presumably trying to communicate. The whole story about God creating everything in 6 days, as this is narrated in the rest of the chapter. Of course, we could always posit that the author's intended audience already knew that there were earlier beginnings before the one that's mentioned here. And if that's true, then I suppose no one would have started asking about other beginnings and lost the plot on what the author was trying to say. But that would be gratuitously speculative. It's more natural, in my opinion, to understand the opening phrase in Genesis 1:1 to mean, in the beginning. In fact, since the absolute and construct forms of Reshit are the same, there's nothing to prevent us from vocalizing the text as Bareshit, with a definite article under the bet. Some commentators have suggested that this was, in fact, how the author intended for us to vocalize it. That said, it could still be asked why the Masoretes chose to vocalize Reshit anarthrously. That just means without the definite article. When grammarians say that a term is anarthrous, they mean that it's written without the definite article. And when they say that it's arthrous, they mean that it's written with the article. Okay, so let's ask, why did the Masoretes vocalize the opening phrase in Genesis 1:1 as Bereshit rather than Bareshit? Well, a commentator named Brent A. Strawn has recently suggested that this vocalization came about through the influence of an exegetical tradition that identified Reshit here with God's wisdom. Look at this passage in Proverbs 8. In these verses, Chokhmah, wisdom, is said to have been acquired at the beginning of God's way, Reshit Darko, and to have been the first of his works of old, Kedem Mifalaiv Me'az. Wisdom is also said to have been set up from eternity, Me'olam, from the start, Me'rosh, from before the earth, Mikadme Aretz. The themes here recall the creation account of Genesis 1. Many of the terms that are used in Genesis 1 are also used here. References are made, for example, to the creation of the earth, the heavens, and the waters. And note especially the use of tehom, deep. In verse 24, wisdom is said to have been with God when there were no depths, be'ein tehomot. And verse 28 mentions the springs of the deep, inot tehom. In verse 27, the phrase, upon the face of the deep, al pnei tehom, is the very same phrase that's used in Genesis 1:2. And then in the other verses, references are made to God's forming of the mountains and hills, the fields, and the dust of the world, Afrot Tevel, all of which can be seen as recalling the themes and ideas of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. There's more intertextuality that could be mentioned here, but for our purposes, I just need to emphasize one other thing. In verse 22, where we're told that God made wisdom the beginning of his ways, the term for beginning is Reshit. In fact, some versions appear to have read Bereshit. And given the other intertextual links with Genesis chapters 1 through 2, this term was plausibly derived from the opening phrase in Genesis 1:1. The implication of the text from Proverbs, then, is that the creation account in Genesis does not tell the full story. Even before the heavens and the earth were created, wisdom was present with God. Okay, bearing these things in mind, now let's look at a few other texts. In Proverbs 3, verse 19, the biblical author is once again reflecting on God's creation of the world. And notice, once again, his use of the term chokhmah, wisdom. The Lord, by means of wisdom, bechokhmah, founded the earth. By means of understanding, bitvunah, he established the heavens. Notice here that the term chokhmah is preceded by the attached preposition bet. Notice too that there's no article under this preposition. It doesn't take the article because the biblical author wasn't talking about some particular instantiation of wisdom, but wisdom in the abstract, or wisdom in general. Alternatively, later interpreters might have understood wisdom here as a kind of hypostasized agent of creation, in which case chokhmah could have been understood as a personal name and wouldn't require the definite article for that reason. In any case, notice that the prefixed bet, which is the same prefix that's used with reshit in Genesis 1:1, is functioning not in a temporal, but an instrumental sense. And so, while we could still translate this as in wisdom, the meaning could be probably more clearly expressed if we were to translate it as by means of wisdom, or with or through wisdom. Okay, and here are some other texts to consider. First, from the book of Jeremiah. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King, the maker of the earth by means of his strength, bekoho, the establisher of the world by means of his wisdom, bechokmato, who spread out the heavens by means of his understanding, bitvunato. Once again, the prefixed bet is being used in an instrumental sense, and so I've translated it as by means of. I could also have translated it as through or with, but I just want you to understand that this is being used in an instrumental sense. And then here's Psalm 104, verse 24. How numerous are your works, O Lord! You have made them all by means of wisdom. Bechokhmah, the earth is full of your possessions. As in the texts we just mentioned, the psalmist here is reflecting on the creation of the world. And as in those other texts, he associates this creation with God's wisdom. Notice, too, that the word wisdom has the attached preposition bet, and it's used once again to indicate instrumentality. Hence, I've translated it as by means of wisdom. Under the influence of these texts from Proverbs, Jeremiah, and Psalm 104, an exegetical tradition emerged by at least the mid-2nd century BC, according to which Reshit in Genesis 1:1 was interpreted as another name for wisdom, chokmah. Just look at some of these quotes from Aristobulus, Ben Sira, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Qumran Scrolls, Philo, and the Targums. And this is just some of the evidence that we have from early Jewish sources. A similar exegetical tradition can be found in the New Testament and in other early Christian sources as well. Strawn suggests that we understand the vocalization of Bereshit in Genesis 1:1 as a scribal nod to this exegetical tradition. Hence, the prefixed bet should be understood in an instrumental rather than a temporal sense, and should be translated like this. With, or by means of Reshit, God created the heavens and the earth. Strawn insinuates that the Masoretic vocalization was actually a departure from what the author of Genesis intended. He adduces some evidence, not very much, but some, to show that not everyone read Bereshit. At least some appear to have read Ba-Reshit, in the beginning. The evidence that he adduces is from 4 Greek transliterations, 2 of which seem especially significant since they come from the 2nd column of Origen's hexapla. He recognizes, however, that this is a minority reading. The predominant tradition appears to have favored an anarthrous reading. Strawn also mentions a pronunciation of the Samaritan Pentateuch that was recorded in 1917 as Ba-Reshit and Ba-Rashet. And finally, he adduces a note in the Masora Parva, which reads, Bereshit 5 times total, 3 times at the beginning of a verse, twice in the midst of a verse. Strawn suggests that this note was inserted as a defense of the anarthrous reading. If that's correct, it could be taken as indirect support for the existence of alternative readings. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Strawn's thesis is intriguing, but it sounds rather dubious. I mean, are we really to believe that an exegetical tradition impacted the way that scribes vocalized and read Genesis 1:1? I was pretty skeptical too. In fact, after I read Strawn's abstract, I almost didn't bother reading the article. But I'm glad I did because I think he makes a pretty compelling case, or at least raises some serious questions about just how much weight we're able to put on the Masoretic vocalization here. There was clearly a very early and very widespread exegetical tradition that linked Reshit in Genesis 1:1 with wisdom. And this exegetical tradition would have been quite serviceable from a theological standpoint because it would have helped reconcile Genesis 1:1 with Proverbs 8, as well as some of the other texts that I mentioned. Listen to this quote from J.L. Kugel. If wisdom was the first thing that God had created, and if God had in fact used it to create the rest of the world, then biblical interpreters had to wonder, why did the book of Genesis leave out this crucial detail? Why didn't the first verse of the Bible read, "In the beginning God created wisdom, and afterwards the heavens and the earth"? In looking for an answer, interpreters noticed a striking coincidence. In Proverbs 8:22, wisdom says, "The Lord made me the beginning of his work," while the Genesis account opens, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Perhaps this was not just a coincidence. Perhaps the word beginning in the Genesis verse was in fact a subtle hint, an allusion to wisdom. For if wisdom is called the beginning of God's work in Proverbs, then, one might argue, the word beginning itself might be used elsewhere in the Bible as a kind of nickname for wisdom, a shorthand reference to the first thing that God created. If so, then the first verse of Genesis could now be understood as meaning not at the start God created the heavens and the earth, but in or with Reshit, wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth. All right, so that's another possible reason for why Reshit at Genesis 1:1 was vocalized anarthrously by the Masoretes. It's because this term was taken as a nickname for wisdom, and the preposition bet was interpreted in an instrumental rather than a temporal or conditional sense. And then there's a third possible explanation for why the Masoretes read Bereshit instead of Bareshit, namely, because from a grammatical standpoint, this word simply didn't need the definite article in order for it to be understood as definite. Many commentators have noted that certain temporal indicators like Reshit, Rosh, Kedem, and Olam could be written without definite articles even when they were being used in a definite sense. And here are some examples of that. Isaiah 40, verse 21, "Has it not been told to you from the start?" Merosh. Isaiah 41:4, "Who has acted and performed, calling the generations from the start?" Again, Merosh. Isaiah 46:10, a verse that we talked about earlier, declaring the end from the beginning, Mereshit. Proverbs 8:23, which we also just talked about. "From eternity I was set up, from the start, from before the earth." This last verse seems especially relevant to our study of Genesis 1:1, because, as we've already seen, it appears to be a theological reflection on the creation account of Genesis 1. But notice, we not only have an absolute noun, Rosh, being used without a definite article under the attached preposition mem, we also have this happening again in the phrase me'olam. So in both Proverbs 8:23 and Genesis 1:1, we've got attached prepositions on nouns that express something about time, and the texts are both theological reflections on God's creation of the world. Okay, and I'll just mention one other reason as to why the Masoretes may have chosen to vocalize the opening phrase of Genesis as Bereshit rather than Bareshit. Namely, because they understood the nomen rectum noun to have been elided. This interpretive option is mentioned by Nachmanides, the famous Jewish commentator of the 1200s. In responding to Rashi, he said that if Reshit really needs to be read in the construct, we can just as well read it as being in the construct with the word kol, everything, all things. In that case, we would translate the sentence like this: "In the beginning of all things, God created the heavens and the earth." Now, Nachmanides only mentioned this in order to show that Rashi's argument was too simplistic. He was saying that even if the point be granted that Reshit in Genesis 1:1 is in the construct, this wouldn't necessarily mean that it's in the construct with the verb bero. Now, Nachmanides himself didn't actually believe that Reshit is in the construct. He was only trying to show that Rashi's argument was not definitive, even if his understanding of the grammar was correct. But Nachmanides himself believed that in Genesis 1:1, Reshit is being used in the absolute state, not the construct. As proof of this, he adduced Deuteronomy 33:21 and Isaiah 46:10, texts that we've already discussed. Nachmanides' own view, therefore, was that Genesis 1:1 be translated like this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So there are at least 4 possible reasons, other than the one that Dan McClellan mentions, as to why the Masoretic scribes chose to vocalize the opening phrase of Genesis as Bereshit rather than Bareshit. And the 3 latter of these are perfectly compatible with the traditional understanding of that phrase. In this video, I've tried to demonstrate that the traditional understanding of Genesis 1:1 is not so implausible as many commentators seem to imagine. Many competent grammarians have argued for the traditional interpretation. Here's just a short list. In the next 2 videos, I'll discuss some of the newer or non-traditional interpretations of Genesis 1:1. Thanks for watching.
If the very first verse of your Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," it's mistranslated. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the death of Superman.